Nothing says we've learned from our mistakes quite like proposing to build another oil pipeline through British Columbia and expecting it to go smoothly this time. Welcome back to Canadian Insights, where we cover the political news that makes you wonder if anyone's been paying attention for the last decade. Danielle Smith just announced that Alberta is exploring 3 possible routes for a new bitumen pipeline to the BC coast, including one that could run all the way to Roberts Bank in the lower mainland, because apparently the Trans Mountain saga wasn't traumatic enough for everyone involved. We're talking about a potential 1 million barrel per day capacity pipeline that would double Alberta's oil production and definitely not cause any political firestorms or provincial tensions whatsoever. So grab your popcorn and your hazmat suit, because we're diving into Alberta's latest pipeline dreams, the British Columbia-shaped obstacle course standing in the way, and why this proposal is either bold economic vision or political fantasy depending on which side of the Rockies you're standing on. Let's start with the audacity, because you have to respect the sheer confidence it takes to pitch a major new oil pipeline to British Columbia after everything that's happened. For those who blocked out the Trans Mountain expansion drama from their memories as a trauma response, let me refresh you. That project took years of political battles, court challenges, Indigenous consultations, environmental reviews, protests, federal government bailouts, and enough controversy to fill a library before it finally got built. It became a symbol of Western alienation, federal-provincial tensions, and the impossible tightrope walk between economic development and environmental protection. Lives were shortened by the stress of that debate. Friendships ended. Family dinners became war zones. And now Danielle Smith is standing up saying let's do that again, but this time with 3 possible routes to choose from. It's like watching someone touch a hot stove, get burned, and then immediately reach for it again while insisting they've got a better strategy this time. The Premier of Alberta is pitching a greenfield pipeline from Alberta to the port of Prince Rupert capable of shipping up to 1 million barrels per day, with the goal of doubling provincial oil production over time. That's not a modest proposal. That's swinging for the fences while the pitcher is actively trying to be new. So what are these 3 magical routes that Smith has up her sleeve? The details are still emerging, but we know one option involves Roberts Bank in the lower mainland, which is basically Metro Vancouver territory. That's right, she's proposing to potentially run a bitumen pipeline through some of the most densely populated and environmentally conscious areas of British Columbia, where the political opposition to pipelines is about as strong as the coffee at your local hipster cafe. Roberts Bank is already home to major port facilities and has been the subject of expansion debates for years because of concerns about everything from orca habitat to air quality to whether the region can handle more industrial development. Now add a massive oil pipeline to that conversation and watch the fun begin. Another route presumably goes to Prince Rupert on BC's north coast, which has been Smith's main talking point and makes more geographic sense in terms of existing industrial infrastructure and shorter distances to Asian markets. The third route is still mysterious, but speculation suggests it could involve other coastal access points or existing corridors. What all 3 routes have in common is that they go through British Columbia, which means they all require navigating the political minefield of a province that's not exactly rolling out the welcome mat for Alberta's oil industry. Here's where the economic argument comes in, because Smith isn't proposing this pipeline just to troll British Columbia, though that's probably a bonus. Alberta's oil producers are landlocked and dependent on pipelines that mostly run south to American markets, which means they're at the mercy of U.S. demand, U.S. prices, and U.S. political whims. Getting direct access to Pacific Tidewater means Alberta could ship oil to Asian markets, diversify its customer base, potentially get better prices, and reduce dependency on the United States. That's genuine economic strategy, not just oil industry propaganda. Doubling Alberta's oil production would mean massive revenue increases for the provincial government, more jobs in the energy sector, and continued economic dominance for an industry that's been Alberta's bread and butter for generations. From Smith's perspective and from the perspective of many Albertans, this pipeline is about economic sovereignty and ensuring the province can maximize the value of its natural resources. It's about not leaving money on the table because your only customer knows you've got limited options. The 1 million barrels per day capacity isn't chosen randomly either. That's serious volume that would make Alberta a much bigger player in global energy markets and provide the infrastructure needed to support production growth for decades. If you're an Alberta premier trying to secure your province's economic future, this pipeline makes perfect sense. But then there's reality, and reality has a British Columbia-shaped problem that's not going away no matter how many routes you draw on a map. BC is not Alberta. The political culture is different, the economic priorities are different, and the tolerance for fossil fuel infrastructure is significantly lower. British Columbians have been increasingly vocal about climate change, environmental protection, and transitioning away from fossil fuels. The BC government, whether NDP or otherwise, has to answer to voters who care deeply about things like old-growth forests, salmon runs, marine ecosystems, and whether their coastline becomes an oil tanker highway. Every route Smith proposes has to go through BC territory, which means BC gets a say in whether this happens. And if Trans Mountain taught us anything, it's that BC can make pipeline approval processes excruciatingly difficult even when the federal government is trying to push things through. We're talking years of environmental assessments, Indigenous consultations that actually have teeth now thanks to UNDRIP legislation, municipal opposition from cities along the route, and activist groups that are extremely well organized and funded. Smith can draw all the maps she wants, but unless she's planning to annex British Columbia, she needs their cooperation. And right now, that cooperation is about as likely as finding affordable housing in Vancouver. The Indigenous consultation piece is absolutely critical here and can't be glossed over like it's some bureaucratic checkbox. Every possible pipeline route goes through the traditional territories of multiple First Nations, and those communities have constitutionally protected rights that must be respected. The days of building major infrastructure projects without meaningful Indigenous consent are over, both legally and morally. Some First Nations might see economic opportunity in pipeline projects and be willing partners. Others will oppose any fossil fuel infrastructure on their lands for environmental, cultural, or political reasons. Getting free, prior, and informed consent from all affected nations along any route is a process that takes years, requires genuine relationship building, and can absolutely result in a no. We've seen pipeline projects get killed or significantly delayed because Indigenous communities said no and had the legal backing to make it stick. Smith's government will need to approach this with genuine respect and willingness to walk away if consent isn't achieved, or they'll end up in court battles that make Trans Mountain look like small claims court. This isn't an obstacle to overcome through clever negotiation. This is a fundamental requirement that determines whether the project can proceed at all. Let's talk about the elephant in the room that's wearing a climate change awareness ribbon, because we can't discuss new fossil fuel infrastructure in 2026 without acknowledging the whole planet is warming and we're running out of time to do something about its situation. Canada has committed to reducing emissions, reaching net zero by 2050, and being a responsible global citizen on climate issues. Building a massive new pipeline explicitly designed to double oil production and increase fossil fuel exports is, how do I put this delicately, not exactly aligned with those goals. The cognitive dissonance is spectacular. Federal and provincial governments keep signing climate agreements and setting emissions targets, then turning around and approving projects that make those targets impossible to meet. It's like announcing you're going on a diet while simultaneously opening a donut shop in your living room. Smith's counterargument will be that global oil demand still exists, that oil will be produced somewhere so it might as well be Canadian oil with Canadian jobs and Canadian regulations, and that Alberta can't be expected to sacrifice its economic future for climate goals while other jurisdictions keep producing. That's a defensible position economically, but it doesn't change the fundamental tension between expanding fossil fuel production and addressing climate change. At some point, those two things can't coexist, and we're rapidly approaching that point. The federal government is going to be caught in the middle of this fight like a referee at a hockey game who's already lost control of both teams. Mark Carney's Liberals will have to decide whether they support Alberta's pipeline ambitions or side with British Columbia's environmental concerns, and either choice alienates a significant voting bloc. Support the pipeline and you lose environmentally conscious voters in BC and across the country who expect climate leadership. Oppose it and you lose Alberta plus anyone who thinks resource development should be a provincial decision. It's a no-win scenario that will test whatever relationship exists between Ottawa and the provinces. The federal government has jurisdiction over interprovincial infrastructure, which means this project needs federal approval regardless of what provinces want. That approval process involves environmental assessments, regulatory reviews, and political calculations that could drag on for years. We might be looking at another situation where the federal government ends up buying the pipeline just to get it built, which worked out so well last time that I'm sure taxpayers are thrilled at the prospect of a repeat performance. There's also the question of whether this pipeline is even economically viable in the long term given global energy transitions. Yes, oil demand exists today and will exist for years to come. But we're also seeing massive investments in renewable energy, electric vehicles becoming mainstream, and policy shifts away from fossil fuels across major economies. Building a pipeline that takes 5 to 10 years to approve and construct, then needs to operate for decades to recoup investment, is betting that oil demand remains strong enough to justify the infrastructure. That's a gamble. If demand drops faster than expected or if carbon pricing makes Alberta oil less competitive, suddenly you've got an expensive pipeline that's underutilized. Private investors know this, which is probably why Smith is floating the idea publicly to gauge interest and support rather than announcing that construction starts tomorrow. Someone has to pay for this thing, and given the political risks and uncertain returns, finding investors might be harder than finding a route through BC. So where does this leave us in the grand scheme of Canadian Confederation and provincial relations? Alberta is signaling it wants to expand oil production significantly and needs infrastructure to make that happen. British Columbia is signaling that it's not interested in being Alberta's oil superhighway to the Pacific. The federal government is signaling that it would really prefer if the provinces worked this out themselves because Ottawa has enough problems already. Indigenous nations are signaling that nothing happens without their consent, full stop. Environmental groups are signaling that they'll fight this every step of the way. And energy markets are signaling mixed messages about long-term demand that make everyone nervous. It's a perfect storm of conflicting interests and there's no obvious compromise that makes everyone happy. Danielle Smith proposing 3 different routes is an attempt to create flexibility and show she's exploring all options, but unless one of those routes magically avoids all the political, environmental, and legal obstacles, she's still trying to solve an unsolvable problem. The reality is that major infrastructure projects in Canada have become nearly impossible to build regardless of merit because our approval processes are broken, our political system creates perpetual gridlock between jurisdictions, and our society is deeply divided on fundamental questions about economic development versus environmental protection. This pipeline proposal is the latest example of that broader dysfunction. Maybe one of Smith's 3 routes actually works and somehow threads the needle between all the competing interests. Maybe years from now we're looking back at this as the visionary project that secured Alberta's prosperity. Or maybe this is just political theatre designed to rally Alberta's base and score points against BC and Ottawa while knowing the project will never actually get built. Either way, the conversation itself reveals everything about where Canada is right now in terms of resource development, climate policy, and whether we can actually get anything done anymore. This is Canadian Insights, and we'll be tracking this pipeline saga as it unfolds because something tells me this is just the opening act of a very long show. If you want to stay on top of the Alberta-BC pipeline drama and every other piece of Canadian political chaos, subscribe now because we're posting multiple videos daily and you don't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment with your take. Should this pipeline get built? Is Smith living in fantasy land? Can Alberta and BC ever find common ground on resource development? Let's have that conversation because it's way more productive than the one happening between the provinces right now. Share this with anyone who needs to understand why Canadian energy politics is about to get very loud again, and if you appreciate the analysis mixed with the snark, hit that membership button. Until next time, stay informed, stay critical, and remember that in Canadian politics, the only thing we can agree on is that we disagree on everything else. See you in the next one.